I want to talk about how we're going to complete the application development when we have to develop an app for our application assignment, for the unit assignment. Now you notice this unit is called mobile application development. Now mobile could be tablet, could be lots of devices that we consider to be mobile, taken away from the desk and used perhaps as a laptop or as a tablet or whatever. Mostly though, we're going to think about phone development because I think that's where most of the interesting stuff is happening at the moment. What I want to do is to consider how things are at the moment, how things are changing, and what we're going to do in order to develop our application. There are two principal operating systems in use at the moment, Apple iOS and Google Android. I know that there are others around like BlackBerry, but mainly we talk about Apple iOS and Google Android when we're talking about mobile app development. There was Microsoft Windows Mobile. It was a brilliant operating system, never got traction, wasn't popular. Was it just the Microsoft effect? Who knows? People like to hate Microsoft. And so maybe it was that. Maybe it just didn't get the devices that it needed. It certainly didn't get the apps that it needed in order to get people to be wanting to use it as their preferred system of development. Okay, so we go back to here. So how do we develop applications for our two main operating systems? For Apple iOS, we use a thing called Objective-C. Now, there are integrations of Objective-C like Swift, but we use mainly Objective-C. It's a C-based language. It's a very strict, tight, very unforgiving language that needs you to be very skilled in order to be efficient. So what about Android? For Android, we use Java. Now, Java's been around for a long time. Java was an attempt at doing cross-platform development. The cross-platform development in Java has had varying success because of the libraries that are needed to be installed on all the devices for it to work across all of the platforms that you want to use. But mostly, Objective-C and Java are very, very much a skill-based thing. You will tend to find that developers are skilled in Objective-C and skilled in Java. Some are skilled in both, but that certainly does require an amount of specialization and development and training that's really beyond a lot of developers. So you tend to find you've got an iOS developer and you've got an Android developer. Some can do both, but not too many. So what has happened in terms of development is that this has an application sort of impact, a development impact. If you have an Objective-C development and a Java development, perhaps with two people, this doubles the expense of developing an application. Now that's a huge cost when applications are shoved out so quickly, so there's a lot of developers working at the same time on a particular application. So what has happened is that people are trying to make use of their existing skills. Now there are far more web developers than there are application developers. And web developers these days use JavaScript, HTML5 and CSS3. Now what are these things? HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, is the thing that displays the stuff in the browser. JavaScript is what makes that stuff interactive. Rather than just a brochure, rather than just a presentation of material or images, it makes it interactive. And CSS3 is a way of styling, the way in which something looks consistently by writing a style and using it wherever you need to. Now JavaScript, HTML5, CSS3, wonderful tools, fabulous tools, and work well. However, there's any number of ways that you can bring these things together to work with each other. And what can happen is that if you have a developer who does these things in a particular way and brings CSS, HTML5 and JavaScript together in a certain way, another developer can't necessarily understand what that person has done. So what we've got now is that there are frameworks, and there's a huge number of frameworks, and here are just a few. This range of frameworks is just some of the things that we would consider to be useful for application development. What is a framework? A framework is a way of setting up the JavaScript, HTML5 and CSS3 in a consistent way always the same in the framework so that any developer who uses the framework will understand exactly where everything is going to be. Now we've got all sorts of things going on here. We've got React, we've got Flutter, we've got Ember jQuery, we've got all sorts of things in Vue, but the one we're going to look at is called Angular, and that's the one that we're going to be using in our development process. Now, what is Angular? Angular is a project sponsored by Google, so it's not something that's been developed independently or by a small developer team, unlike Vue, which is a kind of a small developer team. Angular is huge, and Angular is used for the development of single-page web applications. What does Angular do? Angular makes things work as web components. Everything you see on a web page is a component. It could be the sign-in box, it could be the title bar, it could be the menu bar. These are all components. And Angular makes each component have a particular file structure that means that everybody knows how they'll always talk to each other. And if I want to get one component to talk to another, I just import it, and that other component can then talk to it. So how's our Angular going to work? Our Angular is just this structure, it's the framework. And while it has some GUI components, those GUI components aren't necessarily easy to use, and they're certainly not very pretty. So I'm going to introduce something called Ionic. And Ionic is now in its 4th iteration. I had a whole set of videos, about 15 or something, 20 videos for the previous 3.18 delivery, and I've had to throw them all away. Because Ionic 4 is new, and I think it's such a good development that if we didn't focus on this, I would be doing you a disservice. So we've got Ionic 4. What is Ionic 4? Ionic is another kind of framework that sits on top of Angular in this case, where the way we're going to use it. But it doesn't have to have any particular framework. It's really a controls framework. And it has a whole library of controls that you can use with preset behaviors that you can tap into to make your application development so much quicker. For example, it has a date component. Now this date component, you could write it. You could write it. But think of the number of hours that you would spend writing something that looked good and functioned well. Ionic does that out of the box. So our Ionic, in our case, is going to use Angular, but Ionic 4, because of the way it's structured and because it's using web components, could use any of the frameworks. I'm choosing Angular to be the back end or the framework or whatever you want to call it for our project because I think it's very effective. So how do we develop in Ionic and Angular? Remember JavaScript. JavaScript is what makes things interactive. I want to introduce you to something called Typescript. Now Typescript is a superset of JavaScript. Typescript makes JavaScript much stricter so that it's much more competent in dealing with data and structures. So we're going to use Typescript. So where we had JavaScript HTML5 and CSS3, we will now use Typescript HTML5 and CSS3. Exactly the same effect is achieved, it's just much stricter and better and more competent. So we've got Angular sitting in the middle, which is a framework that deals with TypeScript, HTML5 and CSS3. And our Ionic is going to give us the controls we need to utilize in order to make these things work. But there's an unanswered question. We've got effectively web components built with TypeScript, HTML5 and CSS3. We've got on Apple iOS and on Android, we've got a different operating system. So what is it that links these two together? Effectively, what happens is we use a plugin to convert the TSS, the TypeScript stuff, into the native platform stuff. I won't be trying to be too particular about that, but things have to be converted to run on the iOS platform and the Android platform. Now, initially, Ionic used a thing called Cordova. You'll have heard of a web server called Apache, which is part of the LAMP stack. Now, Apache developed Cordova as a plugin that converts effectively web components into native app components. But what Ionic have done is that with the branching out into Ionic 4, they've developed their own plugin called Capacitor. Now, Capacitor is very powerful and is still in beta. In fact, Ionic, the one we're going to use, is still in beta. You are going to be right at the cutting edge of how this stuff is developed. So that you can go into an interview and you can say, oh, what did you do? I did this. And the bloke will say, well, or the woman will say, the person that's interviewing you, well, how did you do it? I used Ionic 4, which is based on Angular, which is actually just a framework for JavaScript, HTML5 and CSS, but we use TypeScript in Visual Studio Code and so forth. So your vocabulary sets you apart. There are other ways of doing this. Absolutely, there are other ways of doing it. You can use this structure, which is the flow of control, the flow of the code, if you wish, across the development processes, or the new one, which is this one, across the development processes. And you can go through these things and become a really competent developer. You'll be exposed to JavaScript, HTML5, CSS3, routing, all those other things. There are simple ways of doing this. You can go to a thing called MIT App Inventor, which gives you a well-functioning Android app. Out of the box, drag and drop. I'm not sure how much you've learned when you do it that way. So if you wish, we're taking quite a hard approach to this. And the application that you will build is very simple. But what will happen during that development process is that you'll have gained an understanding about how things interact with each other when they're becoming useful in the mobile environment. As I say, there are easy ways of doing this, and perhaps I've given you a hard way of doing it. But if you follow along with the videos as I do them in the structure that I've given them, do them in the order that I've given them, you'll have a working app that will run on both iOS and Android without any different code being needed. It simply has to be compiled. Now, all that's built into Ionic, the capacity to compile something through Capacitor into a native app. And we call these apps hybrid apps. They're kind of not really a native app, but they behave like a native app. And one of the great things that we can do with hybrid apps is we can very cleverly and very simply convert them into PWAs. Now, the discussion of PWAs, progressive web apps, is a separate discussion. But what we're going to do is we're going to develop a hybrid app. And what you end up with is a collection of web components that run in a type of a browser on the device. The browser component is invisible to the user. They just think they've got an app. But a hybrid app gives you this component-based development. And it's really powerful, and it's what we're going to do in our application.